Okay, here's some more information for you about urban land use models. We're going to start with the Burgess model. This was created in the 1930s and it was based on the city of Chicago. And as you can see, it's a very sort of uniform pattern, and it's called a concentric ring model. And that's because all of the rings start in the centre and they work their way out in a concentric pattern towards the outskirts. The land use areas are very similar to the main four that we've talked about already. So you've got the central business district right in the city centre. Surrounding that, we've got what we would class as the inner city with factories and industry, and moving out again to another area which would also be classed as the inner city, where working class housing is. And if you think back to the photograph of the street in Manchester that I showed you, that's what those housing would look like. Then as you move your way out further still to where it says the middle class housing, this would be more similar to the suburb photograph that I showed you. And then the commuter zone is where we get to the rural urban fringe. There's some limitations with Burgess's model, not least the fact that it was designed in the 1930s and designed around in an American city. It's quite old, obviously, and at that point lots of people didn't have access to their own transport and their own car. So actually, as a result of that, land use has changed significantly because people are much more mobile, and therefore cities don't need to be built in order to cater for people getting in and out of the city by public transport, because we can now get ourselves there independently. New working trends and housing trends have emerged since this model was developed. Many people now choose to live and work outside the city on the urban fringe, a phenomenon that's not reflected in the Burgess model. So if you think about out-of-town retail centres, where the land value is a bit cheaper, lots of companies are setting up places outside the city, and it's also easier to get to. You don't have to get stuck in traffic jams, etc. So the pattern is now evolving over time. Every city is different. There is no such thing as a typical city, so actually trying to simplify what a city looks like into one model that fits all is actually impossible. A few years later, Hoyt got in on the act and he decided that he was going to amend the land use model and reflect the changes that happened in terms of transport. So he uses the same categories as what Burgess uses, but as you can see, it's now divided into sectors as well as having the concentric rings. Now, these sectors tend to work from the city centre outwards, following what would usually be major transport or access routes. So it is based loosely on the Burgess model, but it's added sectors of similar land use where you might find them concentrated in the city. Notice how some of the zones, e.g. the factories and industry zone, radiate outwards, and as I've said, this is probably following the line of a main road or a railway. So you would have factories and industry located along a railway, so it's easier for them to transport produce and components that they would need to build things in their factory. You also need to know for the exam what strategies have been used to cope with urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is the spreading of urban areas through the countryside and kind of eating up land around the cities. So it's uncontrolled, it's not planned, it tends to be evolving over time. One of the strategies that's been used is the introduction of green belts. Now, this is an area of land that's mainly open countryside, and it might include some small settlements that surround urban areas. These are protected from development. The number and type of buildings that can be erected is restricted, so planning permission is not normally given to developers. They stop the outward growth of city and prevent towns and cities merging together to form a continuous urban area. They protect the open nature of the countryside, and they preserve the land for farming and also to provide access for recreation, so for example golf courses. London is a typical example of a city that has been surrounded by what we call a green belt, and that's illustrated here on the map. Another opportunity is, rather than spreading the city and keep on building new facilities, that actually we could try and redevelop the inner city and make it more attractive for people. So rather than building new houses, do up the old houses. So this involves modernising of old properties, such as old railway buildings and docklands, for example, and this means that people can carry on living there, reducing the need for new housing estates around the edge of the city. And then finally, another option is developing brownfield sites, so sites that have already been developed by building industrial sites with the built-up area rather than developing out-of-town greenfield sites. So if there's warehouses or factories or kind of industrial units that are no longer used, rather than just leaving them to kind of collapse and deteriorate, developers can get in, knock down all the old buildings and build new housing. You will need to know some case studies for this, so we'll need to have a look at the London Docklands and at Milton Keynes, and we'll look at those again in a separate section. Okay, that's all for now.